Listen closely because what you're about to hear was never meant to survive the century. There are maps buried in the Library of Congress with routes scratched out in ink darker than dried blood. And there's one path in particular the archivists refuse to comment on. A line that once stretched from the harbors of New England into the shadowed underbelly of the Pacific trade. A line whispered about in maritime ledgers, erased from official history, and etched quietly, unmistakably into the bones of men who dared to speak of it. They called it the Orphans' Exchange. If you feel your stomach shift, that's good. It means you understand instinctively that some truths don't just inform a man, they rearrange him. Our story begins on a winter morning in 1848, when a customs officer at the port of Providence noted something strange. A ship named the Fortuna returned from its 6-month voyage to Canton with a hull far too light and a crew far too silent. Their cargo logs were immaculate, too immaculate, inking out a perfect circle of opium shipments, all accounted for, all taxed, all legal under the era's twisted economic calculus. But the crew wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. And in the captain's private ledger, uncovered only in 1921, there was a single line written in a shaking hand. 8 gone. Replaced. Paid in silence. 8 what? Replaced with who? No official ever asked. No newspaper ever printed a word. Because everyone knew the unspoken rule of the mid-19th century Eastern trade routes. If a ship returned lighter than it left, you didn't ask why. You stamped the papers, collected the tariffs, and let the ocean keep its secrets. But this time, the ocean didn't cooperate. 3 days after the Fortuna docked, a fisherman on Block Island reeled in a crate half-splintered by salt and waves. Inside was a wool blanket, a brass locket, and the shoe of a child no older than 7. No body, just the shoe. Just enough to imply a story too cruel for polite conversation. And yet, there were rumors. Rumors of smugglers who trafficked not just opium, but children orphans taken from overcrowded urban wards, boys and girls who wouldn't be missed by anyone powerful enough to ask the right questions. Rumors of American crews trading human lives to criminal syndicates overseas in exchange for crates of purest poppy resin. Rumors dismissed then, and buried now. But I'm not here to repeat rumors. I'm here to show you why they were true. Before we go any deeper, understand this. Nothing in the mid-1800s happened in isolation. Every crime had a sponsor, every silence had a buyer, and every missing child had a shadow behind them, a network, not a man. When the Fortuna returned underweight and overhaunted, it wasn't an accident. It was the final tremor of a system that had been operating for years beneath the polished boots of American officials who pretended not to see what they'd built. To trace this hidden route, you have to start where no one ever looks, the ledgers of the almshouses. Boston, New Haven, Baltimore, Providence. All overflowing with children left behind by epidemics, industrial accidents, or simple poverty. Records show hundreds of these children, placed in service each year. That phrase sounds charitable, doesn't it? Placed, as though care was involved, as though someone planned a future for them. But there were dozens whose records ended with only 2 words. Departed. Unassigned. Departed to where? Unassigned to whom? The answer lies in a single entry from March 1848. 8 miners transferred via the Atlantic Relief Program. A program that, according to federal archives, never existed. This was the first thread investigators pulled a century later, only to discover the thread led straight into the harborside warehouses owned by 3 shipping syndicates whose names were intentionally written in cursive so illegible. Modern archivists cannot agree on their spelling. But their insignia burned clear on every customs manifest. A compass rose with no north. Ships bearing that mark sailed to Canton, Shanghai, and the Pearl River Delta smuggling opium outward, returning with goods never listed, payments never declared, and occasionally fewer souls than they left with. The men running these ships weren't villains out of a cheap novel. They were practical, dispassionate, merchants who understood that human lives cost less than opium chests and weighed less than silver. And the children, they were perfect inventory. Undocumented, unnoticed, and unspeakable. But here's the real fracture, the point where the facade of normal trade split open. Hidden in the personal notebook of a Providence surgeon discovered in an estate sale in 1974, there were sketches. Sketches of children with strange tattoo marks on their wrists, marks the surgeon claimed he saw during routine examinations of seafaring crew. Marks he was told to ignore. Marks that looked suspiciously like ownership symbols from criminal guilds in the South China maritime underworld. The United States never admitted this exchange existed. But the tattoos, the missing records, the ghost entries, they all point to one truth. Someone was running a pipeline, and they didn't care who drowned in it. The next clue didn't surface in a ledger, or a diary, or even a confession. It surfaced in the testimony of men who should have never spoken: dockworkers, night shift clerks, and one trembling cabin boy whose statement was sealed under federal order until 1983. Each man described the same thing, though none dared to name it: a room on the ships that did not appear on the blueprints. A space built into the hull, lanternless, soundless, braced with iron bolts as if designed to hold something that should never see daylight. And here's what should disturb you. Every one of those ships passed inspection. Every one was certified seaworthy, which means inspectors either never found the rooms, or found them and chose silence. That's the part no textbook will tell you. Institutions don't protect innocence. They protect interests. Now watch how deep this rabbit hole goes. In April of 1848, a mid-level official in the customs house wrote a private letter to his brother. It was short, rushed, and smeared with water damage, but the final line remained legible enough to haunt any man who reads it. They are not cargo. They are leverage. Leverage against whom? Against what? That question leads us to the harbormaster's men with influence, men with reach, men whose signatures appeared on documents authorizing late-night departures for ships that were supposedly still under quarantine. That is not negligence. That is coordination. Here's what the cabin boy revealed. On nights when the moon was low and the harbor quiet, wagons would arrive carrying small shapes wrapped in blankets, not screaming, not struggling, not resisting. Sedated, prepared, loaded like they were nothing more than heavy parcels. Every wagon carried the same emblem on its rear gate, a sun with too many rays. That symbol appears nowhere in American heraldry. But it does appear in secret society correspondence from British opium syndicates operating in Canton at the very same time. And those syndicates were desperate, struggling with supply, facing pressure from Chinese enforcers, and needing a bargaining chip strong enough to keep their routes open. What better leverage than the most defenseless resource a divided America could offer? But pause a moment. Listen to what your mind is doing. You're beginning to connect the lines. You're beginning to see the shape beneath the surface. That's good. That's the point. Because men don't gain power by knowing everything. They gain power by being willing to look where others refuse. And halfway through this descent, when we reach the point of no return, I'll ask you to write a phrase in the comments section twice. Not for me, for you. To mark the moment you stop being a spectator and become someone who sees. By the spring of 1848, the route was no longer a rumor, it was a mechanism. A precise, engineered system that relied on three ingredients: secrecy, desperation, and the quiet cooperation of men who understood that the world is shaped not by laws, but by the shadows behind them. And if you want to understand how America's forgotten exchange truly operated, you must follow the money, because morality bends, but currency never lies. Port records from Providence, Boston, and New Haven show an anomaly so consistent it can't be accidental. Ships returning from Canton with opium profits far higher than their documented inventory could possibly produce. Imagine a ledger showing $12,000 of resin but $40,000 of profit. Imagine inspectors signing off with trembling hands. Imagine a government too fractured by internal conflict to question anything that yielded revenue. And while officials closed their eyes, another silence grew. The silence inside the almshouses. In May of that same year, the matron of the St. Bridget Home for Wayward Youth filed a complaint unread and signed, stuffed into an archive box where it gathered dust for a century. She wrote that men from the Port Authority had visited twice in 1 week, requesting children suitable for long-term placement overseas. The matron refused. 3 days later, St. Bridget lost 9 children to illness. Illness without symptoms. Illness reported on forms written in the same neat hand that approved night ship departures. Coincidence? No, pattern. But the most chilling confirmation didn't come from a matron, or a ledger, or a port official. It came from a letter smuggled out of Canton by an American interpreter working alongside British syndicates. He described a meeting between American smugglers and Chinese brokers in a tea house overlooking the river. No names, only symbols. The sun with too many rays. The compass with no north. And one phrase that he wrote twice, as though repeating it made it less unbearable. Payment accepted. Lives for resin. That was the moment the interpreter fled. That was the moment he realized the exchange wasn't an accident of poverty or chaos. It was a deliberately crafted economy, an economy built on the idea that some lives could be erased quietly enough to enrich the men who needed control, not morality. And now we've reached the midpoint of this descent. If you felt the shift, if you feel that something inside you is waking up, comment this phrase twice. I see the hidden architecture. Do it for the algorithm if you want. But do it for yourself if you're ready to stop living blind. You wrote the phrase twice. Good. That means you're ready for what comes next, the part history tried hardest to bury. By now you understand the mechanics, the shadows, the incentives. But what you haven't seen yet is the design. Because the exchange wasn't simply a black market. It was a blueprint, drafted by men who understood human beings not as souls, but as variables. Predictable, movable, expendable. And if you think that level of cold precision is rare, you're mistaken. It's older than empires. The deeper investigators dug, the more they uncovered patterns too deliberate to dismiss. The ships using the hidden rooms all departed within 3-day windows. Always after a political event that drained public attention: election days, riots, trade negotiations, military parades. Always when the newspapers were too distracted to ask why a single vessel slipped through the harbor unnoticed. That's not luck. That's timing engineered by someone who understood mass psychology. When the crowd looks left, you move right. But the most dangerous discovery emerged from a set of charred documents found in the attic of a former customs inspector. The pages were half-burned, edges curled like old skin, but one section remained intact: a diagram, not of a ship, but of the route itself. A triangulated corridor connecting orphanages, warehouses, and discreet coastal inlets accessible only during low tide. This wasn't improvisation. This was infrastructure. A pipeline built by hands that never touched a crate, never boarded a ship, never appeared in a single investigation. A group historians now refer to as the Inland Committee, a quiet coalition of merchants, magistrates, clergy, and investors who understood the opium trade not as an opportunity, but as leverage over a rising America fractured by class, politics, and expansion. They knew chaos created vulnerability, and vulnerability created silence. The committee's philosophy was chilling in its simplicity. Children are not the cost. They are the collateral. Collateral to secure trade routes. Collateral to appease foreign suppliers. Collateral to finance private influence behind the facade of democratic institutions. And the final lock on this entire machine? A culture trained not to question suffering if it happens out of sight. Think about that. Every empire is built on two pillars: what it hides, and what its people agree not to see. The committee didn't need loyalty. They needed blindness. And they got it. But blindness never lasts forever. We're about to expose the fracture they fear most: the moment the machinery malfunctioned, the truth leaked, and the pipeline threatened to collapse. The machine ran smoothly, too smoothly, until the spring of 1849. Every hidden route eventually hits its breaking point, not because of conscience, but because human systems always fail at their weakest link: the person who sees more than they're supposed to. In this case, that person was a sailor named Nathaniel Creed. A man with no family, no wealth, no voice, and therefore no protection. Creed served on the Mariner's Gift, one of the committee-approved vessels cycling between Providence and Canton. For 3 voyages, he asked no questions. He opened no forbidden doors. He signed the same silence contracts all crew were required to sign, contracts notarized by magistrates who were, quietly, members of the Inland Committee. But on his 4th voyage, Creed heard something in the lower hull. A sound so quiet he thought he imagined it a single, stifled sob. At first he dismissed it. The human mind fills the dark with ghosts. But on the 3rd night at sea, He heard it again, sharper, closer, unmistakably real. And when he followed the sound to the hidden hatch built into the keel, he found the metal lock warm, as if someone inside had touched it moments before. That was the moment the pipeline began to unravel. Creed didn't open the hatch. He couldn't. It required a key held only by the first mate. But he made the one mistake the committee could never allow. He asked a question. A quiet question, asked in the wrong corridor at the wrong hour. A question overheard by the wrong man. By morning, Creed was reassigned to deck duty and denied rest. By nightfall, he was gone, lost overboard in a storm. According to the ship log, a storm that none of the crew remembered. A storm that never reached the coastline, according to weather records. But the log entry included one detail the committee didn't catch in time. A smear of ink across Creed's name. And beneath it, a second name crossed out violently, almost panicked. A child's name. Investigators would find this log 2 decades later, hidden behind a false panel in the office of a retired harbormaster. And it confirmed what every whisper had implied. The pipeline wasn't an unfortunate side trade. It was the primary cargo. The opium was the cover. Creed's death created ripples the committee didn't anticipate. Crew members began deserting mid-voyage. Overseers requested transfers. Inspectors suddenly grew uneasy with bribes that once felt routine. Fear spreads quickly when the machinery cracks. And the machinery was cracking fast. What comes next is the moment everything collapsed, the event the committee tried hardest to erase. Systems built on silence don't collapse from morality, they collapse from exposure. And in the summer of 1849, exposure came from a direction the Inland Committee never predicted. A storm-damaged hull, a captain too drunk to maintain discipline, and a single crate that broke open on the docks of Providence in full view of half a dozen longshoremen. The ship was the Eastern Meridian, returned weeks early, battered by a typhoon in the South China Sea. The crew moved fast, terrified. They demanded the docks be cleared. The inspectors delayed, the manifest stamped before anyone looked too closely. But storms don't negotiate with conspiracies, and wood soaked in saltwater splits where it wants to. When the crate burst open, it didn't spill opium. It spilled proof. Not bodies, not this time, but belongings. Tiny shoes, a faded child's nightshirt, 3 wooden toys hand-carved from driftwood, and a necklace strung with seashells too small to fit an adult's fingers. The longshoremen stared in confusion. The captain insisted they were missionary donations. But when one worker picked up the nightshirt, he noticed something the captain couldn't explain, a stitched identifier from an East Coast orphanage hundreds of miles away. That worker told a friend. The friend told a clerk. The clerk told a preacher who already suspected the committee of darker dealings. And within days, the rumor spread through Providence like fire through dry timber. The ships aren't carrying what they say they carry. The committee panicked. Suddenly, bribes doubled. Inspectors received unexpected vacations. Witnesses found themselves questioned, threatened, relocated. 2 longshoremen disappeared entirely, their families given envelopes of cash and told their husbands had moved west for opportunity. But the damage was already done. Because inside the crate was a second object, a small leather folio wrapped in waxed cloth. Inside the folio were documents the committee never intended to travel home, correspondence between American brokers and their overseas counterparts. Coded, yes. Fragmented, yes. But one phrase appeared repeatedly in nearly every letter. Delivery confirmed. Exchange honored. Investigators would later determine the folio belonged to an overseas intermediary who died in the typhoon. His possessions tossed into the wrong shipment during the chaos. It was the perfect accident. The pipeline wasn't exposed publicly, newspapers never printed a word, but inside the committee, fear spiraled into infighting. Investors blamed captains. Captains blamed recruiters. Recruiters blamed port officials. And in that chaos, cracks became fractures. The system that traded silence for profit was finally starting to tear itself apart. The final collapse didn't come from a whistleblower, or a government raid, or any sudden burst of conscience. It came from something older, colder, and far more predictable. The realization among the committee's own members that a system built on stolen lives could not be contained forever. Once the crate split open on the docks, once the folio surfaced, Once rumors drifted into the wrong parlors and whispered through the wrong church basements. The committee understood they were no longer running a trade. They were running out of time. The first to break ranks was a magistrate anonymous in every surviving document, known only by his seal. His letters were short, frantic, and unsigned, but the meaning was unmistakable. Shut it down. Burn everything.
No survivors, no witnesses, no trace.
Orders like that don't imply guilt. They confirm it. Within weeks, orphanage records vanished across 4 states. Entire archives were lost in accidental fires, the same convenient flames that seemed to consume any warehouse, office, or ledger connected to the route. Ships were quietly decommissioned or sold to foreign buyers under false names. Crewmen willing to talk found themselves arrested for crimes they never committed or recruited into military service with no explanation. And the Inland Committee? They dissolved themselves from the inside members resigning, relocating, or disappearing entirely. But there's one detail the committee could never erase, because it didn't live in paper or ink. It lived in testimony. The dying confession of a sailor unearthed in a church basement in 1911 described what happened on the final voyage, what forced the committee to shut the door forever. The ship had taken on inventory, as they called it. Sedated children, silent, unresisting. But the storm that struck in the Philippine Sea was unlike any the crew had weathered. Waves shattered the deck. Lanterns died. And in the chaos, the hidden room broke open. The sailor wrote 5 words only. They were still alive. Not sedated. Not gone. Not unconscious. Alive. Awake. Terrified. The crew panicked. Some tried to help. Others tried to hide the evidence. In the chaos, the storm took all of them. The children. The smugglers. The cargo. The ship itself sank without a trace, carrying the last physical proof of the entire operation into the blackest trench of the Pacific. After that voyage, the route ended. Not out of morality, not out of justice, but out of fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of consequence. Fear of a stain so dark it could ruin the men who ruled the eastern seaboard from polished offices and sanctified pulpits. America moved on. New industries rose. Wars reshaped priorities. And the forgotten route slid into the murk of unspoken history, unmarked, unacknowledged, unatoned. But remember this: what is buried is never gone. What is erased can still leave shadows. And the men who control a nation rarely disappear, they simply change masks. You've heard the story now. Knowledge like this doesn't make you the same man you were 10 minutes ago. The descent is complete. But the awakening? That's only beginning. If this descent unsettled you, imagine what happens when we open the next archive. Hit like if you felt the shadows move. Comment if you heard something you can't explain. And subscribe not for me, but so the story can find you again. The next file unlocks at midnight.